My name is Hannah, and I'm 33 years old. The moment my father told me I was never meant to inherit anything happened in a quiet conference room at my parents' lawyer's office. The air smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. My brother Ryan was sitting across from me, leaning back in his chair with the kind of relaxed confidence that always made people assume he belonged anywhere he walked into. Dad didn't even look at me when he said it. You were never meant to inherit anything. The words landed so casually it took my brain a second to process them. The lawyer, a thin man named Mr. Whitaker, froze with a folder halfway open in front of him. I stared at my father. I'm sorry, what? Dad finally looked at me then, but there was no hesitation in his face. The trust was always meant for Ryan. My brother didn't say anything. He just looked down at the table like he was trying to hide a smile. I felt my chest tighten. Because 3 weeks earlier, when Dad passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, my mother had told me something very different. She said the family trust would be divided between us. 50-50. Her exact words were, "Your father wanted things to be fair." But sitting in that office, watching my brother's calm expression and my father's lawyer shifting awkwardly in his chair, I realized something wasn't lining up. And that meeting turned out to be the moment everything started unraveling. But the truth behind it actually started years earlier. Growing up, Ryan was what people in our town called a natural. He was good at everything that impressed people quickly. Football in high school. Charisma. Confidence. The kind of personality that made adults laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny. My parents loved that about him. Especially my dad. Dad ran a small construction company in Oregon that specialized in high-end custom homes. Over 25 years he built it into a solid business, bringing in somewhere around $2 million a year in revenue by the time Ryan and I were adults. Ryan always said he'd take over the company someday. But he never actually worked there for long. He tried for about a year after college. Then he got bored. After that he bounced between ideas. A landscaping business. A real estate partnership. An attempt at opening a sports bar with 2 of his friends that collapsed after 8 months and left Dad covering nearly $60,000 in debts. Every time something failed, my father would step in. Ryan just needs the right opportunity, he'd say. Meanwhile, I took a completely different path. I studied accounting. Quietly. No big celebrations or attention. By 28 I was working as a financial analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm in Portland, earning about $78,000 a year and slowly building my own savings. My parents were proud of me in a polite, distant way. But Ryan was always the one they talked about. Ryan's next idea. Ryan's future. Ryan's potential. For a long time, I accepted that dynamic. Families fall into patterns. I told myself it didn't matter. Then about 4 years ago, something changed. Dad started talking about retirement. Running a construction company into your 60s isn't easy, and the physical stress was starting to show. One night during dinner at my parents' house, he said something that surprised both of us. I've been talking to a financial advisor about setting up a family trust. Ryan immediately perked up. What kind of trust? A living trust, Dad said. Something that protects the company and the house when your mother and I are gone. My mom nodded quietly beside him. Ryan leaned forward. So what does that mean exactly? Dad shrugged. It means the assets are protected and passed down properly. I asked the practical question. How big are we talking about? Dad gave a small smile. Well, the company, the house, and the investment accounts together are worth somewhere around $3.4 million right now. Ryan's eyebrows lifted. Seriously? Dad chuckled. You'd be surprised what 30 years of construction profits add up to. Then he looked at both of us. The trust will make sure things are taken care of when I'm gone. Ryan didn't even try to hide his excitement. So how does the split work? Dad took a sip of water. Equal, he said. 50-50 between you two. Ryan's smile tightened slightly, but he nodded. Fair enough. I didn't think much about that conversation at the time. But looking back now, that dinner might have been the moment Ryan started planning something. Because over the next year, his behavior changed in small ways. At first it seemed harmless. He started visiting our parents more often. Helping Dad with errands. Stopping by the construction office. Just trying to learn the business, he said once. Dad loved it. Ryan's finally taking things seriously, he told me during a phone call. I was happy for them. Honestly. I thought maybe my brother had finally matured. But then something happened that made me pause. About 18 months ago, Ryan asked me an unusual question. We were sitting at a coffee shop after my mom's birthday dinner. Out of nowhere he said, "Have you ever looked into how trusts work legally?" I shrugged. Not really. You're an accountant. You deal with financial stuff. Taxes and corporate budgets, I said. Estate law is different. Ryan stirred his coffee slowly. So if someone changed the structure of a trust, would the beneficiaries know? The question felt oddly specific. What do you mean? Like, could someone adjust percentages? Probably, I said. But there would be paperwork. And people would see it? Eventually. Ryan nodded slowly, like he was storing the information. I didn't think much about that conversation until months later. Because around that same time, something else happened. Dad started including Ryan in more and more business decisions. Site meetings. Contract negotiations. Even discussions with the company accountant. Meanwhile, I stayed on the outside. No one excluded me intentionally. But I wasn't part of the company, so it made sense. Still, I started noticing a pattern. Ryan was slowly positioning himself as Dad's successor. Then, about 6 months before Dad died, my mother mentioned something interesting during a phone call. Your father updated some legal documents recently. What kind of documents? I asked. Oh, just the trust and some estate paperwork. Anything major? She hesitated. I'm not sure. He handled it with Mr. Whitaker. That name stuck in my memory. Because Mr. Whitaker was the same lawyer sitting across from me now in that quiet conference room. And judging by the uncomfortable look on his face, he knew something about this situation that I didn't. Back in the present, my father cleared his throat. Hannah, he said calmly, I know this might feel sudden. Sudden. The word made my chest tighten. You told us 4 years ago the trust was 50-50. That was before circumstances changed. What circumstances? Ryan shifted slightly in his chair but still didn't speak. Dad folded his hands on the table. The company needs stable leadership. I stared at him. And that means I get nothing? You have a stable career, he said. Ryan needs the company. The logic felt so twisted I almost laughed. Ryan needed it? After losing money on 3 different businesses? You're giving him everything? I asked. The majority. What does that mean exactly? Dad looked at the lawyer. Mr. Whitaker reluctantly opened the folder in front of him. He slid a document across the table. I looked down at the numbers. My stomach dropped. Ryan would receive 85% of the trust assets. The company. The house. Most of the investment portfolio. My share was 15%. Roughly $500,000. Which might sound like a lot of money. But compared to the full $3.4 million trust, it was barely anything. Ryan finally spoke. Hannah, it's not personal. I looked up at him slowly. Not personal? You don't even want the construction company. That's not the point. Dad's voice hardened slightly. The decision has already been made. Something about the certainty in his tone made a strange feeling settle in my chest. Not anger. Not sadness. Suspicion. Because the numbers on that page raised a question that none of them seemed to realize yet. A question that would change everything once I started digging into the documents behind that trust. And the truth I eventually uncovered would make that quiet meeting in the lawyer's office turn into something none of them were prepared for. I kept staring at the numbers on the paper in front of me. 85% to Ryan. 15% to me. The words blurred slightly as my brain tried to catch up with the reality of what I was looking at. For most of my life, I had accepted that Ryan was the favorite. He was louder. More charismatic. Easier for people to admire. But favoritism at family dinners was one thing. Rewriting a $3.4 million trust was something else entirely. I slowly lifted my eyes from the document. When was this changed? The question hung in the air for a moment. My father glanced at Mr. Whitaker. The lawyer cleared his throat. The trust amendment was executed approximately 8 months ago. 8 months. My mind immediately started calculating. That would have been around early spring. Right around the time Ryan had started showing up at the construction office almost every day. What exactly changed? I asked. Dad leaned back in his chair. The percentages. That's obvious. Ryan shifted in his seat. Hannah. I raised my hand slightly. Just answer the question. Dad's voice stayed calm. I decided Ryan should take over the company. And that required giving him 85% of everything? It simplifies ownership. My accounting brain automatically started running through the logic. It didn't add up. Even if Ryan took over the company, the trust could easily have split other assets evenly. The house alone was worth about $900,000. The investment portfolio was roughly $1.1 million. There were dozens of ways to structure it fairly. But this wasn't structured fairly. It was structured to give Ryan almost everything. And suddenly something else started bothering me. If the trust amendment happened 8 months ago, why hadn't anyone mentioned it? Mom had told me about updated documents. But she never said the entire inheritance structure had been rewritten. I turned to the lawyer. Did both beneficiaries sign anything? Mr. Whitaker shook his head carefully. No. Beneficiaries don't typically sign trust amendments. That was true. Legally, Dad could modify his trust however he wanted. But the way everyone in the room was acting made something feel off. I leaned forward slightly. Did anyone else attend the meeting when the amendment was signed? Another pause. Then the lawyer said quietly, "Your brother was present." I looked at Ryan. He didn't even try to deny it. Dad asked me to sit in. Why? To talk about the future of the company. My father nodded. That's right. I studied Ryan's face. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Like someone who had already rehearsed this conversation in his head. But another thought had started forming in the back of my mind. Something subtle. Something most people might not notice. But accountants notice details. And the document in front of me had a detail that bothered me. I tapped the paper. This amendment references the updated valuation of the company. Dad nodded. Yes. When was that valuation done? Last year. By who? The company accountant. I felt a small chill run through me. Because I knew exactly who that accountant was. A man named Carl Jensen. I had actually met him once at a family barbecue. And something about that memory suddenly clicked into place. Because during that conversation, Carl had said something very specific. He mentioned preparing financial projections for Ryan's possible leadership role. At the time I assumed he was just discussing normal business planning. But now the timeline felt different. I looked back at my father. The company valuation used for this trust amendment, was it updated this year? Dad frowned slightly. No. So the trust percentages were changed based on last year's numbers? Yes. My stomach tightened. Because if the company valuation hadn't been updated, then something important was missing from the calculation. Something that could dramatically change the trust structure. I looked at Mr. Whitaker again. Was any independent financial review done before this amendment? The lawyer hesitated. That wasn't required. Was it done anyway? No. That answer confirmed what I was starting to suspect. The entire trust amendment had been written based purely on internal information. Information controlled by my father and my brother. Ryan leaned forward slightly. Hannah, why are you interrogating everyone? I'm asking questions. It's Dad's money. Yes, I said quietly. But it's also his legacy. Dad's voice hardened. The decision is final. Maybe it was. But something about the structure of this trust felt sloppy. And my instincts were telling me there was more behind it. A lot more. The meeting ended awkwardly after that. Dad stood up first. Ryan followed him out of the conference room. Neither of them looked back. Mr. Whitaker lingered for a moment, gathering papers into the folder. I stood up slowly. Can I ask you something off the record? He looked at me carefully. That depends on the question. Did my father seem pressured when he signed this amendment? The lawyer's eyebrows lifted slightly. Why would you think that? Just a feeling. He studied my face for a moment. Then he sighed quietly. Your father seemed very confident in the decision. That wasn't the answer I was hoping for. But he added something else. However, your brother did most of the talking during the meeting. That sentence stayed with me the entire drive home. Ryan did most of the talking. Not Dad. Ryan. Which raised a very uncomfortable possibility. Had Ryan convinced Dad to restructure the trust? Or had he done something more manipulative? That night I sat at my kitchen table with a laptop and a notepad. If I wanted to understand what happened, I needed to start with the timeline. So I wrote down 3 dates. First, 4 years ago, Dad announces the trust will be split 50-50. Second, 8 months ago, trust amendment signed giving Ryan 85%. Third, 3 weeks ago, Dad dies suddenly. 3 points. 3 events. But something important sat between the first 2. Ryan's sudden involvement in the construction company. And the company valuation that influenced the trust percentages. Which meant the answer probably wasn't in the trust document. It was in the financial records. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. Carl Jensen. The company accountant. He answered on the 3rd ring. Hannah. Hi, Carl. Well, this is a surprise. I have a quick question. Sure. When was the last full valuation of Carter Construction done? He paused for a second. About 14 months ago. That matched what Dad had said. Has the company's value changed since then? Carl chuckled softly. Oh, yeah. How much? Another pause. Why are you asking? I just need to understand something. He hesitated again, but eventually answered. Well, the company landed a huge municipal contract about 6 months ago. My pen froze over the notebook. What kind of contract? City redevelopment project. How big? About $4.8 million over 3 years. My heart started beating faster. Because that single contract would dramatically increase the company's valuation. Was the trust amendment done before or after that contract? Carl thought for a moment. Before. I felt my stomach drop. Because that meant something very important. The trust had been restructured based on old numbers. Numbers that drastically undervalued the company. Which meant the percentage Ryan received wasn't just unfair. It was mathematically manipulated. And suddenly a terrifying possibility crossed my mind. What if that timing wasn't an accident? What if Ryan knew about the contract negotiations, and pushed Dad to amend the trust before the company value increased? I ended the call and sat quietly for several minutes. Because if that theory was right, then my brother hadn't just taken advantage of favoritism. He had deliberately engineered the trust structure to maximize his inheritance. And if that was true, then there might be something legally questionable about the entire amendment. But proving it would require something much more powerful than suspicion. It would require evidence. And I had a feeling that evidence was hiding somewhere inside the company's financial timeline. I just didn't know yet how big the discovery was about to be. Because the next piece of information I uncovered didn't just raise questions about Ryan. It raised questions about the legality of the entire trust amendment itself. And once I saw it, I realized something shocking. Ryan might not just lose the extra inheritance. He might lose everything. I didn't sleep much that night. Numbers have always been the way I understand the world. When something doesn't make sense, I start pulling on threads until the pattern reveals itself. And the numbers around my father's trust were full of threads. The first thing I did the next morning was open my laptop and start reconstructing the timeline as carefully as possible. 14 months ago, Carl completes the company valuation. 8 months ago, the trust amendment is signed. 6 months ago, Carter Construction secures the $4.8 million municipal redevelopment contract. 3 weeks ago, Dad dies. On the surface, nothing looked illegal. But something about the order of those events felt deliberate. If Ryan knew the city contract negotiations were underway, then pushing Dad to amend the trust before the contract was finalized would make the company appear less valuable. And if the company appeared less valuable, the trust percentages could be justified more easily. It was a clever move. But clever didn't necessarily mean legal. I grabbed my phone and called Carl again. He sounded surprised. Hannah. Everything okay? I need to ask you something specific. Sure. The city redevelopment contract, when did negotiations start? Carl didn't answer right away. Why? Just humor me. He sighed. Let me think. I believe the initial proposal came in about 9 months ago. 9 months. That meant negotiations had started before the trust amendment. Did Ryan know about the negotiations? Carl chuckled. Of course he did. He attended 2 of the early meetings with your dad. My pen stopped moving. 2 meetings? Yeah. Your dad wanted him involved in the company more. I felt a chill run down my spine. Because that meant Ryan knew the company was about to land a massive contract. And he had convinced Dad to rewrite the trust right before the company's value skyrocketed. But that still wasn't the most disturbing part. What about the trust amendment? I asked. Carl hesitated. I didn't work on that. But you must have seen it. I saw the updated asset summary your dad requested. And? Carl lowered his voice slightly. It struck me as unusual. How? Well, the company valuation used in the trust amendment didn't include pending contracts. That's normal. Yes, Carl said slowly. But usually when negotiations are that advanced, they're at least mentioned in asset projections. And they weren't? No. Which meant Ryan had pushed for a financial snapshot that intentionally ignored the most valuable deal the company was about to sign. Technically legal. But ethically questionable. And possibly something more. Carl, I said carefully, did my father seem fully aware of the contract timeline when he amended the trust? Carl paused again. I can't really say. But Ryan handled most of the financial discussions during that period. The same phrase Mr. Whitaker had used. Ryan did most of the talking. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair. The more I looked at the timeline, the clearer the pattern became. Ryan hadn't just benefited from the trust amendment. He had likely orchestrated it. But even if that was true, proving manipulation after my father's death would be extremely difficult. Unless there was documentation showing Ryan had influenced the decision using incomplete information. I spent the next 2 days digging through every public record related to Carter construction. Permit filings. City contracts. Procurement notices. Eventually, I found something interesting buried in a municipal database. A preliminary development proposal dated 10 months ago. Submitted by Carter Construction. Signed by my father. But the contact person listed on the proposal wasn't Dad. It was Ryan. Which meant Ryan had been deeply involved in negotiations long before the trust amendment. And if he knew the deal was coming, the timing of that amendment started looking less like coincidence. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. What I needed was something concrete. Emails. Documents. Anything that showed Ryan pushing for the trust change. I wasn't sure where to find that. Until my phone rang unexpectedly that afternoon. The number looked vaguely familiar. I answered. Hannah. The voice belonged to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Mark. Mark Davis had been my father's project manager for almost 15 years. He knew the company better than almost anyone. Sorry to call out of the blue, he said. I heard about your dad. I'm really sorry. Thank you. We spoke for a few minutes about the funeral arrangements. Then his tone changed slightly. I also heard about the trust situation. I frowned. How did you hear that? Ryan mentioned it when he came by the office yesterday. Of course he did. What exactly did he say? That he's taking full control of the company now. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Did he seem confident? Mark laughed quietly. Very. Something in his tone made me curious. What? Well, Ryan's been acting like he owns the place for months already. Months? Yeah. I leaned forward in my chair. Mark, can I ask you something? Sure. When did Ryan start getting involved in major company decisions? About 9 months ago. 9 months again. Right around the time the city contract negotiations began. Did Dad seem comfortable with that? Honestly? Yes. Not really. That surprised me. What do you mean? Mark lowered his voice. There were a couple meetings where Ryan pushed pretty hard for things your dad wasn't sure about. Like what? Financial restructuring. My heart skipped slightly. What kind of restructuring? I don't know the details, Mark said. But Ryan kept talking about estate planning and asset protection. Estate planning. Asset protection. Exactly the topics involved in the trust amendment. Did Dad agree? Eventually. How? Mark hesitated. Ryan kept saying it was necessary for tax reasons. That explanation sounded familiar. Ryan loved using complicated financial arguments when he wanted to convince people. Especially my father, who trusted numbers but didn't always understand them deeply. Mark, I said slowly, did you ever see any emails between Ryan and the company accountant about the trust or asset structure? There was a long pause on the line. Why? Because if Ryan pushed Dad to restructure the trust while hiding the pending contract value, that could be a problem. Exactly. Another pause. Then Mark said something that made my heart start beating faster. There might actually be something. I sat up straight. What do you mean? A few months ago I accidentally saw an email thread when I was using the office computer. Between who? Ryan and Carl. My pulse quickened. What did it say? I didn't read the whole thing, Mark said. But Ryan was asking Carl about whether future contracts had to be included in asset valuations. My stomach dropped. Are you serious? Yeah. And what did Carl say? He explained that pending contracts could change asset projections but weren't technically required for trust valuations. Exactly the loophole Ryan needed. Do those emails still exist? I asked. They should. The company email server archives everything. My mind started racing. Because if those emails showed Ryan researching ways to minimize the company valuation right before convincing Dad to amend the trust. That wasn't just clever. That could be considered intentional financial manipulation. And if a court decided Ryan had influenced Dad's decision using incomplete or misleading information, the trust amendment itself could be challenged. Which meant the entire 85% inheritance might disappear, leaving the original trust structure intact. 50-50. Or possibly something even worse for Ryan. I thanked Mark and ended the call. Then I sat quietly for a long time. Because for the first time since that meeting in the lawyer's office, the situation didn't feel hopeless anymore. In fact, it felt like the balance of power had just shifted. Ryan thought he had secured control of the entire family fortune. But he didn't realize something yet. He had left a trail. A digital trail. And if those emails said what Mark thought they said, then my brother might have accidentally created the evidence that could destroy his entire inheritance.